All right. One of the key issues here in the state of Utah has to deal with growth. And we've seen pushback from voters out there and from residents out there. Remember the big development down there in Ochre Hills area where they were pushing for a massive development, but people in the south end of the county said no. Then we had the debate over expansion or the Cottonwood Mall, not expansion per se, but what to do with that very valuable piece of property in the Cottonwood Mall area. The city approved a very aggressive plan. Voters said no. They collected signatures. They got the issue on the ballot. It was approved by voters, and Utah's Supreme Court said go ahead and deal with that. Well, what about the issue of housing, affordable housing, housing affordability, and growth? How big of a challenge is this for cities up and down the Wasatch Front and throughout the entire state? Joining us on our Newsmaker line to talk about that is Cameron Diehl, Executive Director of the Utah League of Cities and Towns. Cameron, how are you, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for the invitation to be with you. I'm well, and I've always enjoyed our chats in the past on transportation and other topics, and look forward to chatting with you tonight.
All right, thank you, Cameron, and I look forward to chatting with you as well. How big of a concern was that vote from the Utah Supreme Court, I should say the decision from the Supreme Court, and the vote in Cottonwood dealing with the Cottonwood Mall?
It's a very nuanced situation, so permit me a moment to provide a little of the context.
Okay.
You mentioned the fact pattern about the Cottonwood Mall being a vacant piece of property for years, a plan that the developers brought forward that the city approved. And the question that the Supreme Court determined was a question of whether or not the decision by the city was referable. The cities, think back to your civics class from elementary school. You have your separation of powers and your three branches of government, right? You have your executive branch, legislative, judicial. Well, a city council in most cities in the state actually can exercise both executive and legislative authority. The legislative authority under the Utah State Constitution rests in the people, and they in turn delegate that to city councils, county commissions, or the state legislature. In this case, the city approved a site plan for the area, and the city believed that that was a function of their executive power. The residents believed that was a function of their legislative power. The Supreme Court said, yeah, we believe that in this particular case, it's legislative, but that doesn't mean that all site master plans, site development master plans are legislative, but in this particular fact pattern it is. So that's where it's a really fascinating and nuanced decision, because the court did not give a clear line to future cities, future property owners, and future community residents about whether or not these plans in the future would be legislative or administrative. That's very fact-specific.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. Go ahead.
So you're paying attention to it, but it may not have an impact on most development projects. Is that what you're saying, Cameron?
I think that question is still up in the air. So you mentioned as we came in the Ochre or the Olympia Hills proposal during the summer. And there was talk of a referendum. There never actually was a referendum because then Mayor McAdams vetoed the project. But nevertheless, you had residents who were upset, and I think the question is why. It wasn't just we're opposed to growth. It wasn't just that we're opposed to high-density housing. Sometimes those are the easy narratives, but they're incomplete. In the case of Olympia Hills, you had residents who were justifiably concerned that they already have overcrowded schools, that they already have congestion on inadequate infrastructure and roads, that there is no transit access. And here comes this development that's going to bring tens of thousands of new residents on an already overtaxed system. Those are really legitimate concerns from residents that local government's in the best place to hear, and frankly, local government's in the best place to address those concerns. And in the case of Holiday, City Council heard all the concerns. They made a decision. The residents disagreed with the decision. That's one specific fact pattern. But you're seeing new housing and new developments all over the Wasatch Front and all over the state. So one fact pattern does not a pattern make.
Cameron, how much are city officials up and down throughout the state having to deal with this question right now? Not in my backyard. You aren't going to put that in my backyard. How often are you having to deal with that now?
Well, when you say deal with it now, I think that's always been with us. It's just you've had some high-profile ones this year that have brought the NIMBY concept to the forefront. But again, I think we all need to dig a little deeper as to why people are concerned about development happening in their backyard. Growth is coming. Growth is here. And we can either manage growth or growth will manage us. And city leaders are trying to find that balance between the needs of current residents and laying the groundwork for tomorrow's residents. And that's a tricky balance, but they're in the best position to figure out that balance.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Cameron, how tricky of a balance is that to find right now?
Well, it is tricky because when you say growth, it's not just about housing. It's also about roads. It's about sewer. It's about water. It's about schools, even though that's not a purview of my membership as cities, but schools are a key component of growth. It's about access to opportunity and recreation, access to employment. All of those things are encapsulated in the term growth. So I represent 1,380 mayors and council members around the state, and they all represent very unique communities. And so what is critical as we talk about growth is recognizing that growth can mean different things in different places, and that cities need to plan for growth, because if you don't plan for it, it'll happen in a way that will just frustrate people even more. And city leaders are actively planning for growth, and they're working hard to do their part. And cities work with residents and developers and property owners and state leaders and other leaders to plan for growth in a responsible way.
Cameron, I wanted to ask you this question because you point out in this op-ed you wrote in the Salt Lake Tribune over the weekend, the difference between housing affordability and affordable housing. What's the difference, Cameron?
I'm glad you picked up on that, because those terms get merged all the time.
Yeah.
And the term housing affordability is the overall cost of housing. So when you look around the region and around the state, housing prices continue to go up, and that in turn puts a squeeze on a traditional family's ability to purchase and own a home. Well, there are lots of different cost inputs that drive up the cost of housing. So one is the population growth. We just have a lot of people that are staying in the state, so kids and grandkids that are staying here, and we have transplants coming here. You have a booming economy that attracts people, and you have some major inputs that are just purely market-driven. For example, you have fewer construction workers today than you did before the recession. That, in turn, leads to an increase in housing costs. Land values are higher today than they were 10 years ago. That leads to a increased cost of housing. Ditto with materials and other construction costs. Now, affordable housing is a term of art that refers to housing for those who make low incomes.
Yeah.
And so that's a different subsection of the overall question of affordability. But when we talk about affordable housing, there are tools that are necessary to be used in order to develop and preserve true low to moderate income affordable housing.
Well, this is a nice problem to have, though, isn't it, Cameron? It's better than going in the other direction.
It's true. You're absolutely right. And mayors and council members are committed to leading in their communities and figuring out a way to plan for growth. Because, like I said, you can either manage growth or growth will manage you. And cities are working hard, and mayors and council members are working hard to plan for it responsibly.
All right, Cameron, great chatting with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rod. Thanks for the time.
All right, the Executive Director at the Utah League of Cities and Towns, Cameron Diehl, talking about cities working to address growth issues and the difference between housing affordability and affordable housing. There is a difference, and also the many challenges that many cities are having to deal with, including my own community, where I live up there in Davis County. More coming up on the Rod Arquette Show Monday, right here on Utah's Talk Radio 105.9 KNRS. Listen, and you'll know.